What's the creepiest thing you've seen at sea? Story 1. Not so much creepy as eerie, but being out in the blue at night in a lightning storm in a slack wind. The ocean was very flat. No big rolling swells, just tiny little ripples. The whole world would be black, and then there would be a flurry of bolts, and the whole world would be silver. The ocean looked like nothing so much as aluminum foil that had been scrunched up and flattened out. The water looked like mercury, and all of the little ripples made these very dramatic black shadows. The water like mercury analogy is correct. I remember paddling out for a morning surf a few times, and when the water is almost flat and the rising sun hits it right, it looks like you're paddling around a sea of mercury. It's still one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. I would often stand upon the decks, gazing out at such a scene, and my fists would clench into a tight white stone at my side as I thought about the whale, that beast which took my leg and my dignity from me. I will find it. I will find it, and to my last breath I will stab at it. That's just poetic. They should write a book about that or something. Story 2. This sort of qualifies. Former Navy here, somewhere off the coast of Italy, saw a very, very small boat, not much bigger than a rowboat, about 9 or 10 miles offshore. This was sometime around midnight. There was no light from land, and no other ships around. It had a light. Our ship captain said it was a fisherman, and the fish would be attracted to the light at that time. Imagine being in a rowboat about 10 miles offshore in the middle of a pitch-black night, waiting to see what finds you. Watched a documentary about a marine biologist who hypothesized the reason we have no giant squid sightings while on deep dives is their fear of man-made light. His way to test it? He'd take one of those two-man subs where the entire front was a large plexiglass-like bubble down off Monterey Bay and drop down to the bottom of the ocean. It drops down to 8K right off the coast. Then he turned off every light in the sub and just sat there looking out the front bubble, in the literal pitch-black darkness at the bottom of the Pacific for hours, just waiting. Screw that. In 2019, I ran a tour on a sail training ship. Big, 4 masts, from mainland Spain to the Canaries. I was in the 0 to 4 guard, meaning we kept the ship going in the middle of the night. We were sailing, hence we had right of way, but we had to keep an eye out for fishing boats. One night, close to Agadir, I was at the helm and had my mates on watch guard at the bow. I could see a dim light close to our course, and kept asking if anyone else saw it. They did not. Still, I believed my eyes and altered our course slightly. A few minutes later, we passed by a tiny wooden boat anchored that had like a blinking bicycle clip light glued to its antenna. By just a few meters, we could see dozing Moroccans on its deck. One waved. Mistakenly, around midnight on the Gulf Coast, we idiot fishermen in a small boat got too close to a gigantic vessel. No radar. Just my idiot friend who knew where it was. 20 minutes in, this jalopy of a boat, we see a light and dart towards it, thinking it's an oil rig. 500 or so yards out, a second even brighter appeared out of nowhere directly aimed at us. Blinding, no hesitation or adjustment light. Of course, we work hard and keep going on. We later saw it was a ship waiting to dock, a gigantic container ship, and we're on a glorified panfish catcher. I then felt how vulnerable we were. One wave and we'd be toast in pitch black darkness. Also, in any current day container ship pirate can even get on board, that's impressive. I mean, this light turned on and was on us instantly. We were just idiots fishing, but if we were armed pirates, we would have got smoked before we knew it. A lot of reasons learned about respecting that relentless ocean. Never underestimate the ocean. Just ask Jack and Rose. Story 3. Empty boats far out at sea. One time on an airport trip, my Uber driver was saying that he used to do security on tankers, that they would run across empty vessels more than you could possibly imagine. Just floating, contents undisturbed, wallets, photos, everything. They would hail them with no response, and not knowing if it was a trap to get close enough or take over the ship. Pirates and ransoming the ship is apparently also more common than you'd think. Not the people though, just the cargo. Anyway, the security team would have to go aboard the ghost ship and scope out the situation. Even yachts. When there was no one aboard, they would sink them to avoid floating strike risks. I was like, surely there is some kind of finder's fee, and he was like, who are you gonna call? Made me really wish a John Krakauer or Sebastian Junger would sink his teeth into that story. It would be a hell of a book. Going for a swim can be deadly. Rudiger Nieberg explained this. He went to South America by boat. He was an adventurer, and he explained that if you go into the water, your boat continues to go west because of the ocean streams, and it goes so fast you cannot reach it anymore. Once he jumped overboard because his radio antenna had come loose and he wanted to catch it. He missed it by inches, but he survived because he had made sure to secure himself to the boat by his ankles. That incident cost him his wife. She didn't hear from him for a long time because the antenna was gone, so she decided he must have passed away and found somebody else. But it didn't cost him his life. Once I had a cabin cruiser in San Diego and I ran out until I hit the blue water because it's mostly green along that part of the coast. It was a beautiful day and I just shut it down and jumped in. I was alone, by the way. When I hit the water, the wind kicked up just a little and I almost lost my life trying to catch it. I'm sure there is some skullduggery afoot with some of the boats, but a simple slip, if you're not tied off, can end you. Can't imagine anything creepier. Story 4. I used to be an oil field diver in the Gulf of Mexico. I'd say about 80% of the dives I logged were at night, mostly 500 feet and under DSVs. It's a very eerie feeling sitting on the downline doing water decompression in the middle of the night. I'd always ask the topside to turn off my headlight, like a worm on a hook just bobbing in the darkness. Not even nearly as extreme as your story, but it evoked a memory. I did a scuba diving open water course and then did the advanced course, which included a night dive in a freshwater lake. I was only 5 meters underwater, pitch black darkness with 2 other guys. We were on a platform and we could either face the dam wall or the open water, and I turned to the open water while the other guys were behind me. I turned off my light. We did have little lights on our backs. Just the deepest, calmest dark I've ever felt and seen. Not a single source of light anywhere, just immense darkness. Still remember that feeling, and it was like 15 years ago. Not the same, but I recently took a trip to Belize in Central America where we did a few cave exploring tours. One of the caves was actually a famous Mayan ritual site that included human sacrifice. The tour guide said that some of the remains were found without any bodily injury, implying that essentially they would take the sacrifice into the cave and just leave them there. He then proceeded to ask all of us to turn off our headlamps for a few minutes to experience what that was like. Chills, man. Damn, this terrifies me so much. Story 5. Some 20 years ago, on the MV Explorer, since sunk, down near the Antarctic Circle, sailing around the bergs and occasionally making landfall, we rounded into a small bay area and there amongst the ice and coast was an unmarked sailing yacht, which is odd as generally yachts have some identifying markings on them. To add to it all, they didn't respond to any radio contact, and whilst I wasn't privy to the conversation, and it was a long time ago, some crew went across via Zodiac and were refused boarding. So basically a yacht, not a particularly large one, was unmarked and was hanging around in the inhospitable waters of Antarctica and didn't want any help or contact. Proper weird. I currently work as a guide in the expedition cruise industry. We watched a video of the MV Explorer aftermath for safety training. Looked like an absolute nightmare to be in open lifeboats without propulsion in Antarctic waters at the edge of an ice field. I currently work as a guide in the expedition cruise industry. We watched a video of the MV Explorer aftermath for safety training. Looked like an absolute nightmare to be in open lifeboats without propulsion in Antarctic waters at the edge of an ice field. I wonder how our ship would have fared in the same situation. Listing, loss of power, sewage flooding out of the toilet, must have been absolute mayhem. At least our lifeboats had roofs and an engine. Friend of mine was the safety officer who stood down by the water pulling everyone from the life rafts onto the passenger vessel Herdegruten MS Nordnorge. They rescued the people from MS Explorer when she sank, and they had such available capacity that everyone they rescued could go get their own cabin and warm shower after the ordeal before they had the opportunity to call home on the sat phone and tell their loved ones that they were safe and sound. Story 6. The bioluminescent animals, or whatever they are, in the water are pretty amazing. Our toilet would fill up with seawater, and if you took a piss in the middle of the night, it would agitate the water and it would glow sometimes. I always loved the bioluminescents flickering around the hull at night. They're almost like a cushion of little stars guiding you safely along. On those really dark moonless nights, I'd almost beg for them to arrive. I sailed a 70-foot yacht around the world a few years ago. Southern Ocean, Cape Horn, Good Hope, Roaring 40s, Furious 50s, 2 equatorial crossings, the full deal. Plenty of terrifying moments, boring moments, funny moments, and beautiful moments. A creepy moment that is burned into my memory involved a near catastrophe halfway between New Zealand and Cape Horn. We ended up hitting really bad weather and absolutely huge seas, 50-foot swells with massive troughs in between. We were running with the swells for days as they grew, skidding down them like a bloated surfboard, always worrying that the next wave would break behind us and roll us over. At night, it's pitch black down there in bad weather. The sky and sea just form a huge black mass. The most terrifying thing is the sound of an invisible wave breaking behind you. At night, you run a red light to preserve night vision, so there's basically just an eerie red glow emanating from below deck. At about 2 in the morning, I was at the helm when a monster wave broke directly over the back of us without a second warning. Time slowed down as it did in those moments, and the last thing I saw was my own silhouette in the wall of water, lit up like an ominous red snow angel. And then nothing but cold blackness as the boat sank into the sea. Fortunately, she popped straight back up like a cork after a few eternal seconds, almost like a submarine surfacing, and we were still in one piece. Still can't forget that glowing red apparition of myself though. The memory of it has woken me up in cold sweat more than once. One of the astronauts to the moon was a US Navy pilot with his instrument lights failing as he was preparing to land. Going blind above the sea during the 1950s. Might have been an F-2H Banshee. Can't remember the article. Blind as a bat, lights all out, and then his eyes adjusted to the darkness, allowing him to see the bioluminescent algae being agitated by the carrier's propellers and landing through a miracle. Story 7. I was on a 32-foot speedboat and got caught by nightfall in between islands. No nightlights on the boat, so navigating using GPS and a depth finder. Captain knew the way like the back of his hand since he'd sailed those waters since he was a kid. But for me, it was my first time in the middle of the ocean at night. Pitch black but for the stars, as above and below it seemed as if the boat was floating in the blackest void of the universe. Years later, I saw the movie Life of Pi, and the scene where Pi is in his lifeboat floating in the dark among the stars, no above or below. It was exactly like that. I still have dreams about that night. The engulfing dark and the silence that was not silent. Surreal. We made it safely to port. Captain fitted the nightlights on that boat the day after. I can only imagine how freaky that experience would be. Your vivid imagery reminding me of an experience I had as a kid. I grew up living in a house on a lake. It was an isolated lake atop a mountain, and we were one of the only 2 houses built along its shores. One winter, when the lake was frozen over solid, the biggest snowstorm of the season blew in. I decided I wanted to see what the storm was like from the middle of the lake, so I wandered out towards the middle, the snowfall quickening, thickening around me as I slowly dragged my boots along the snow-covered ice. I walked for a while until I guessed I was somewhere near the middle, only occasionally turning around to view my footprints, ensuring I could still clearly see my way back. Looking behind me, I could see it was white. My house well beyond visibility range, looking forward only white. Left and right, white. I looked down, the whole lake's surface was enveloped in the same white. Eventually, I lay down and just stared up at the sky. The same white. White everywhere. It was so trippy and disorienting, but beautiful. Story 8. I worked on a sailboat one summer in the Bahamas, and something that you see a lot when you're in the ocean in kayaks and life jackets floating around, and you always radio them in, but they always just fell off a yacht or something and it's never a big deal. Once we found a kayak floating and it had a fishing rod and the rod holder, which basically meant someone was using it. I was about 2 kilometers offshore, Western Australia, kayak fishing in the middle of nowhere, knocked a rod overboard and didn't hesitate to take off my life jacket to dive in and get it. I chased chased it down a good distance before giving up. When I got back to the surface, the kayak was now a good 15 to 20 meters away, thanks to way more wind present than I'd realized. I barely managed to swim back to it, giving everything I had as it continued to get blown away. It was very nearly the end for me that day over a stupid fishing rod and a rash decision. My neighbor's line snagged when he was trolling and he forgot the boat was in gear, grabbed it and went overboard. Didn't have a life jacket. He was a former Navy pilot, so his wife was telling the Coast Guard not to end the search. The next day they found his boat in some mangroves, and using the onboard GPS they could see where it started doing a dead man's turn, where there was no one controlling it and it went in circles. They found him almost 24 hours later still swimming somehow. The life jackets aren't always a sign someone drowned. They are sometimes, of course. They also just fall overboard sometimes. Same with life buoys, rafts, and lifeboats. The ship I work on has lost 3 life rafts in a storm in the last 3 to 4 years. There are a couple of cameras that point aft. We had footage of them being ripped off the life raft station, auto-inflating, and then getting dragged along for a bit till the painter line snapped. I've heard of a whole lifeboat, big enclosed fiberglass lifeboat, being lost on the western side of the Atlantic, being recovered a month or so on the eastern, and the company that owned it had it freighted back, reconditioned, and put back into service. Story 9. Somewhere in the Atlantic, nice cold as hell night, decided to step out and look at the stars. About 10 minutes on, and a boat's mast pops up, sits there a few minutes, and then back under. No alarms, nothing. Just some sub-boys getting a bit of late-night O2 in the middle of nowhere, next to some friends. I think people underappreciated how chilling it must have been to have a sub under or near you. I've been in a boat in areas they're known to be present, generally speaking, and just looking into the water and thinking of it under there freaks me the hell out. Not sure why. Just some folks doing their job. Those vessels are terrifying though. I completely forgot the entire concept of submarines needing to come up for oxygen. That sounds terrifying. Story 10. In 20 years, the weirdest stuff I've seen is other people that work out here. About 40% of the sailors like what they do and are good at it. Another 40% are good at it but would do something better if the money was right. But there's another 20%. If they lived ashore for more than 6 months a year, they'd end up dead or incarcerated. There's no more west for them to go, so they went offshore and became our problem. To elaborate on the 20%, we've had people poop in storage compartments not far from a toilet. If you have a female crew member, there will be one guy you have to fire for sexual harassment, or he just can't handle it, so he goes into the community area toilets and pisses everywhere. There will always be one that overshares, either about his visits with prostitutes, a stripper he met in Jacksonville, or about his love doll collection. The rest are harmless. The first engineer that knows everything about crypto, the second mate that will tell you to invest in real estate, a lifelong third mate who's always scheming for something else. He's taken EMT classes, real estate classes, and moonlight as a volunteer firefighter in his time off. And there's always a third engineer or third mate that spends their time off traveling alone all over the world. You'll have an AB that has more than one wife in different countries, another AB that despite being illiterate owns 15 rental homes and has 9 kids he's put through college, and some kid from Wisconsin who has no idea how he ended up out here. I'm surprised it took this long for someone to simply say people. Story 11. I have a friend who works on ships. He said the single scariest thing he has ever seen was looking out a window and seeing a wave that he said looked like it was 100 meters high, pass right by their boat, and suddenly disappear. He knew about rogue waves, but he said seeing one that big and that close and watching it suddenly just vanish was so creepy and shocking that he was literally stunned for a minute. Have you ever been in your car in a parking lot stopped and the car next to you starts moving but you think it's you? I'm wondering if the boat was a little angled when he was inside looking out the window, making it seem like there was a huge wave, but then when he went out to see it, there was nothing. I'm not saying he was wrong, but this was my first thought reading this. I mean, entirely possible, and the tilting makes it look like the wave is bigger? I'm not sure. I mean, he's been a sailor for over 20 years, so I imagine he would be experienced and could tell if it was the boat tilting or something, but I don't know. At the same time, I've seen some videos of how rogue waves might form, and it seems possible possible. I mean, there's a long history of sailors reporting rogue waves and being ridiculed for it up until like the 1990s, I think, when an oil rig detected a wave that was like 3 times the height of all the other waves hitting the rig that day. And it was also supposedly 2 or so times the theoretical maximum size theoretically at that time, of a wave in open water. Since then, more research has been done on rogue waves, and it's been proven that waves can get much, much taller than the old 30-some foot theoretical maximum. Story 12. Contract Mariner. I disappear into the blue area for 6 to 8 months a year. Creepy? Not much, honestly. The sound of moaning steel due to slack tanks when you're rolling really hard can be a bit unnerving. St. Elmo's fire is pretty neat. Fata Morgana, aka the Flying Dutchman, is pretty cool to see in real life. After a while, the only thing out there that really spooks you is a problem you have that directly influences your survival. All the spooky stuff I've ever been a part of have been no BS emergencies. Fire in the engine control room? I'm the first responder down there to see if it's an actual emergency or a messed up concilium sensor. Wall of toxic smoke from burning electronics and the high voltage room? Oh snap. Have an emergency weather sortie because we are dragging anchor and rolling 30 degrees with 50 feet UKC and we're getting pushed towards the island? Screw me, 10 shots ain't enough. We are about to run aground in a 55,000-ton, 800-foot ship. Pucker factor. Oops. Now we get the hookup to get out of there. We immediately lose steering and propulsion. Good stuff. I've seen brand new $1 million sport fishers capsized and bobbing around like a cork 1,000 miles from land. I've seen tiny little songbirds skipping along the surface, just barely clinging to life, but they're flying as hard as they can to find land. Some of the saddest stuff I've ever seen are those little birds skipping off the water as they fly further out to sea, hoping to all hell they come across some land. I don't know. I'm on the Yingling of the port bar, and I'm rambling. To answer your question in TLDR style, the creepiest thing about being out there is the bottomless depths of sadness, loneliness, and heartache. You will go to places in your mind that words will never be able to do any justice in trying to describe. This guy boats. Story 13. The creepiest thing I've seen has definitely been seeing myself and other crewmates lose our minds. On one particularly awful voyage, everything that could go wrong went wrong, and we found ourselves without food, water, and sleep for a very unhealthy amount of time. It started off with auditory hallucinations. Ships are noisy, and when you're going crazy, you begin to think those noises are talking to you. I heard children laughing, a choir singing, and creepiest of all, a particular splash sounded like it was calling my name from the sea. Combine that with visual hallucinations, and then things get really terrifying. I was convinced we were in the desert at one point, with sand all around us and mountains in the distance. Another crew member freaked out and told us we were about to run into an apartment building. The creepiest thing I saw was an all-black flying pig with red eyes on the bow. I think the scariest, though, was when someone was convinced we lost part of our crew overboard. It turned into a massive delirious argument over where everyone was, even though we were all accounted for. That trip was brutal, and the captain put us all in a terrible situation due to sheer incompetence. Other than that, there was this one time I saw 3 gigantic ships in the distance with no lights, and they did not show up on AIS. Suddenly they were gone. It was extremely creepy. I used to drive through the night as a musician. I know exactly what you mean. A few times I had to pull over. Not intoxicated, but hallucinating is probably scarier than intoxicated and hallucinating. One time I kept seeing bushes in the middle of the road, or one time I'd start going through a tunnel that wasn't there. That's pretty much when I noped out and pulled over. An hour later, getting home is worth it. Doesn't matter how awake you are, your eyes need rest. As someone who has hallucinated while driving in the past, stopping is definitely worth it. Story 14. Oh, hey, one I can actually answer. So this isn't the creepiest story, I'll admit that straight off. I was working on a tiny oil rig off the Gulf Coast. It was about 2 p.m. I was on what was called sliver duty. Basically, you wait in between 2 relatively close together walls on the exterior of the rig, strapped into a safety harness, while someone skirts through a long flow cable that you direct. Boring, but you get a nice view of the ocean for an hour or two. Suddenly, my buddy on the other end of the sliver starts screaming to look down. I do, and see the biggest sea creature I've ever seen in my life. End to end, it must have been the size of most rural hospitals I've seen, just pushing below the surface of the water. It raised its head out, and I realized I was really dumb and was staring at an undersea cable placer. What a fantastic unit of measurement! Rural hospitals. Story 15. I was drinking at an airport bar and met a woman who worked as a commercial fisherman on her way to SE Asia for R&R with her family. Real salt-of-the-earth lady. She regaled me with stories about her work, all the good stuff about working in her world, all the reasons she kept doing it for decades. I asked her what the scariest thing she saw out on the open ocean was, and without any hesitation she said, "Oh, an underwater UFO. I saw one rise up out of the ocean next to my boat and fly off into the sky." The matter-of-factness of her answer bothers me to this day. It's pretty intriguing how often unidentified objects seem to be reported flying into/out of the ocean. If such things are to be believed, it suggests there's something about the ocean we don't really know that these things do. Orbs hitting the surface and disappearing below like there's no water to hit, flying up and out faster than any modern human-built aircraft. It really makes me wonder, at least speculatively, of the possibility that our first encounter with aliens will be things we learn having been living in the depths of the planet long before we arose. This has been commonly mentioned for centuries. I figure it makes sense. If I'm an alien visitor and I want to lay low, and I notice these Earthlings don't go into the blue part of the planet as much, if my tech can handle it, of course, I will hide out there. Far less likely to be seen than somewhere populated on land. That's why the Decepticons had their base there in the 1980s Transformers cartoon anyway. Story 16. I'm no longer at sea, but used to, as a younger chap with romantic ideas, spending months on end on cargo ships. Mostly tankers, crude oil VLCC, and refined product tankers, but with a little time in oil and gas in towing. I came ashore in 2017 with a Master Unlimited ticket, sailing as chief officer. My last ship was a self-discharging bulk carrier. Anyway, I digress. It wasn't so much about what I saw that was creepy. I saw plenty of interesting things I wouldn't have seen anywhere else. However, I was second mate on a tanker distributing refined oil products around the coast of New Zealand. A yacht had sailed from a port on the east coast, bound for another port just down the coast a bit, but it had disappeared. Solo sailor on board, aside from his dog. Nonetheless, the search proved fruitless and it was suspended. However, 4 weeks afterwards, at about 01:30 in the morning, the Rescue Coordination Center would broadcast a plea at the end of the weather and navigation warning broadcast asking for the yacht to make contact if it could hear the message and was able to do so. I'd sit in the dark, chain smoking and working on my 7th cup of coffee, looking out into the black, imagining the guy who's had a stroke or heart attack on board with the same broadcast playing out on his radio while his dog ate his face to keep from starving. Or imagining him having fallen over the side, imagining what it would be like watching your yacht sailing indifferently off into the distance with your dog in the cockpit pacing and agitated, unable to do anything about it, knowing you were screwed and had a matter of hours, if that, left to live before the cold got you or exhaustion. Or imagining the dog starving and dying on a yacht by itself weeks later, listening to the same broadcast in the dark. The places your mind goes in the dark by yourself. They found the yacht in the end. The dog was still alive. Well, at least the dog lived. Story 17. I was underway from the port of Houston to Cartagena, Colombia. The vessel cuts all lights off on the outside of the boat, so it's pretty dark outside. I would always go and sit out on the deck and listen to my headphones, and looked at the stars. Well, one night, somewhere in the middle of the Caribbean Sea, I noticed a swarm of lightning bugs cross the boat. Totally blew my mind to see light out of nowhere. At least I think it was lightning bugs. On the same trip heading back to Houston from Colombia, I witnessed a satellite crashing. At least that's what I think it was. It steadily strobed and lit up the night sky and water for about 15 minutes until I couldn't see it anymore. And on a different trip, I was in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. No moon, no clouds, no light pollution. The amount of stars that I saw made me cry. Never thought starlight alone could cast a shadow. Definitely mesmerizing. I still remember it like it was yesterday. Sitting out on deck in the dark somewhere, out around Cat Island, I reckon, anchored. All the stars reflected back on the still waters, and we were surrounded by such interminable beauty. I never knew the world could be so peaceful and wondrous. I saw what I thought was a flare south of Kodiak Island one night, wasn't completely sure, but I called it into the Coastal Guard and went back and forth with them for probably an hour describing it while heading in its direction and shining the searchlight all around looking for a life raft or something, until they came back to me saying they correlated it with the first stage of a rocket re-entering the atmosphere. I was sort of bummed because I was hoping to save someone, but it was pretty cool anyway because I've always wanted to see a rocket launch, and it felt like the next best thing. But anyway, that may have been what you saw, also being that there's a famous launch facility in Houston. Story 18. Sometimes at nighttime, I have gone out of the accommodation, leaving compartment on board merchant ships to breathe some fresh air or to take out the trash since the garbage station was outside. And when it is completely dark and the water is calm, you hear the splashing water against the ship's hull. Well, I can't explain why, but the ocean water was luring me. But at the same time, you are terrified since nobody will find you if you fall overboard. So sometimes I was just staring at the water in the dark, and inside me was some struggle, like part of me wanted to jump in, while the other was terrified that it would be a one-way ticket. Can't still find the explanation for this hypnotic, mesmerizing feeling I get, and at the time, the chills running down my spine, that if I would fall into the water, it's game over for sure. That's called the call of the void, and it's more common than most think. Ever had to stop yourself from turning into oncoming headlights? COV. Believe it or not, it's your brain's way of protecting you. Stop doing weird stuff to protect me, brain. Story 19. A few things come to mind, but I have to say, deadheads. In my younger days, I was captain of a dragger out of the Kodiak AK. She was a 130 Giddings marine trawler. I will never forget my first week in the wheelhouse with the owner, who was retiring and showing me the operation before I took over. After a night busting ice off the rails in freezing rain and 2-meter seas, he went to bunk and left me to wheel watch. I was clearing up with a medium haze and flat calm waters. Most of the crew was sleeping or hanging out in the galley, so I was alone and the only eyes forward. I'm drinking some nasty Folgers and sucking down a Marlboro Red when I see what looked like an old pier piling straight ahead. I kept looking at that spot and nope, nothing there. A few seconds later, I swear I saw that thing again, but only closer. Nope, gone again. I thought, damn, I've been up way too long and I'm hallucinating. Then out of nowhere, this tree trunk shoots directly up into the sky. This thing had to be 60 feet tall and was about 30 off the bow, dead center. I damn near pooped myself. I pushed to port and rubbed the tree with the right side of the bow. We were at a good 14-knot clip, which is as fast as hell for an almost fully loaded trawler. Then it shot into town and disappeared midship. I later learned that these are pretty uncommon in the Aleutians, where we were fishing. They're called deadheads, and only 2 of the guys on the boat had seen them before. They float vertically and bob straight up and down. These things were known to destroy older wood boats and kill crews. I'm just glad I wasn't dragging the net, and it would have cost us in the ballpark of 100K. I've seen what most people would consider to be worse, but the fear that a huge bobbing tree in the middle of Alaskan waters comes out of nowhere tops my list. Thanks for watching until the end. If you have a similar story to these that you would like to share with us, please leave it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave us a like, and don't forget to subscribe. For more videos like this one right now, please stop by our channel. Thanks again, and see you next time.